hear some readings by Colton and Mihalyi, whom I will perhaps, well, everybody knows who you are, but would you stand anyway? I did bring the stool out so you could sit instead. Perhaps you can get up and down. Before we begin, I'd just like to say that any of you who are not members of the society who would like to join, we are more than happy to take new members on at any time during the year. We have some lovely exhibits upstairs. We are focusing this year on the Keystone Chemical Company in Glenfield from back in the 20s. We also have an exhibit on resort hotels in Lewis County. We focused on 4. The Branningham Inn at Branningham, the Spring House in Lowville, the Hermitage at Bonaparte, and the Fenton House out at number 4. And they're all very interesting. We have an Adirondack guide boat upstairs in one of the rooms. Unfortunately, the upstairs rooms are not open this evening. So you'll just have, now you have a good reason to come back. Okay. In the event that we should need to leave the building at some point during the evening, you can exit either through the front door, through the jib window directly behind me, through the kitchen area, or through the library doors. This evening's program is sponsored in part by Poets and Writers Incorporated out of New York City, the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, the Lanyon Foundation, and the New York State Council on the Arts. And enjoy this evening's program. Lou, would you like to begin, sir?
To give you a little idea of background here before I start, for a number of years I've been playing around with some fiction. I wrote a series of short stories which I tried to tie together as the stories were either seen through the eyes of a small boy or he was a part of them. Sometimes he didn't know he was. And I had maybe a dozen or so that these I worked at. They're based some on some people that I knew or some incidents that did happen, although I want to point out they are strictly fiction. I had a great problem in just tying these together. I thought maybe that I could flow from one story to the next, but it really hasn't been successful from my point of view. And so what I've done with some of them is revise them, and I've tried to peddle them around, and in a small way I have been successful. I'd like to read you several of them this evening, some which are just the way they came out, some that have been revised a number of times. This first one is entitled Run, Kelly. Well, I'll let you see what does happen. Brainerd Kelly was a slim athletic boy who liked to run. He seemed to have learned to run before he learned to walk. Run, as he was called, obviously, was the son of Mrs. Kelly's oldest daughter who died in childbirth. Mrs. Kelly brought him up as one of her own. When Jim Kelly, her husband, died, Ma Kelly had a hard time, but somehow she managed right through the depths of the Depression. Run always ran. As he grew up, running became more and more a part of his life. As he grew older, he also developed a passion for cars. He combined this with running. He developed a series of car noises that he used as he ran. To begin a run, it was necessary to start the car. Was the starter engaging the motor. After several tries, the motor would catch. Grung, grung, grung. After several grungs, he would gun the motor and start off down street. His motor would roar as he got up to full speed after shifting gears. Then as he reached his cruising speed, the engine would purr. like a shiny black Model A Ford rolling down Main Street. Burdick's store sometimes used Bun to deliver groceries. When he took a bag of groceries over to Mrs. Krause, he had to go up Oliver Street, which was rather steep. He would slow down the pumping of his free arm, which simulated the piston movement, and shift down with the free hand. Then with the motor revved up, he would climb the street. Sometimes it was necessary to shift down to low gear. With the motor roaring, he would reach the top, shift through second, into high, and down to Mrs. Krause, who was just down the street. He usually screeched as he braked to a stop at the back door. After delivering the groceries, Bun would retrace his route, shifting down to get some braking power from the motor as he went back down the hill. With both arms free, 2 cylinders would function, pistons pumping back and forth until he was back at the store. The delivery fee was 5 cents a bag. If business was slow and he had a 2-bag load, he would frequently make 2 round trips to deliver the 2 bags rather than both at once. Bun just liked to run. When he got to high school, his running stood him in good stead as he became one of the school's basketball stars. Bun's fast break was the main reason for the Glenfield Hawks being in contention for the league championship during his first 2 years on the varsity. During his senior year, his fast break was the only reason that Glenfield won its only championship ever. Ben Casey was a traveling man, a traveling salesman. He used to call at the GW building in town to take orders. GW had a daughter, Dee. Ben liked Dee and the store. And within short order, they were married. The store was a typical general store that carried just about everything anyone in a small rural farming community could want. If GW didn't have it, he would surely get it for you. After GW died, Ben and Dee continued to run the store. They fancied themselves a cut above the rest of the people in the town. They were perhaps the richest people in town. Even though the Depression was in full swing, they continued to make respectable profits. They adjusted their prices so they were reasonably competitive. Dee was a condescending woman. You always had the idea she felt she was doing you a favor just by talking to you. Ben was a little more affable, but the same feeling was there. If the town ever became a monarchy, Dee would be queen and Ben would be her consort. She would rule with him by her side. To Dee, Glenfield had the right and wrong side of the railroad tracks. This was based on the wind in her residence. The railroad ran north and south through town. The prevailing westerlies blew locomotive smoke to the east, right on hung-up washings. Those living near the tracks on the east side always hung their washings inside or on porches and kept train schedules in mind. Those on the west side rarely had a problem. Dee never did her own washing, but nevertheless, she never failed to point out the wind advantage she had on her side of the track. The Caseys never used a local doctor. Dee was afraid that whatever ailments she might possess would become known about the town. At the same time, she never failed to describe her problems to the ladies as they sat at her bolt counter examining the cloth she had in stock. Dee did not have much patience with children. She had to tolerate them in her store, especially when they were with their parents, but she made no bones about not wanting children of her own. Pregnant early in her marriage, she had miscarried, and that was enough. Some townspeople privately wondered about their conjugality when she failed to become pregnant again. But the truth was that after her marriage, she went to a high-priced doctor in Utica who recommended a book. She followed it religiously and to such extreme that there never was any doubt about the outcome. Ben had always wanted children, or at least an heir. He resigned himself to being childless when Dee's true feelings became apparent after her miscarriage. One day, Ben asked Run to deliver some groceries. Run was back in short order, which impressed Dad. So he began to use Run more and more. Once he took Run to a small trout stream where they spent a fantastic afternoon catching their limits of fat, brilliant brook trout. Then even debated going to the high school to watch Run play basketball. As the relationship developed, Ben fantasized putting Run through college. His affection for Run was genuine, but these fantasies never surfaced, as he knew Dee would explode. Though both the Kellys and Caseys were Catholic, Run lived on the wrong side of the tracks. His widowed grandmother, barely able to make ends meet, just was not an acceptable person. So Ben just worked out his desires in fantasy. Ben was the only World War I veteran in town who had been commissioned. This was another reason why he indeed felt superior to the people in town. His commission training had included first aid. So when Dee fell one evening, coming down from their upstairs apartment, he diagnosed her injury as a broken arm. The arm was painful. Dee could not stand pain. She was an absolute baby when it came to blood or any kind of discomfort. Ben splinted it, put it in a sling. Dee was nauseated, so Ben decided she should go to the hospital in an ambulance. Ben owned a large Cadillac. He loved to drive it around the country and show it off. But because they had established such long working hours, he did not get to drive it much except on Sundays and holidays. The Caseys always went out for Sunday dinner. They were the only people in town who went out for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter dinners. In fact, they were the only people in town who used restaurants. The Depression being what it was. They were a small part of the town's mainstream, such a small part that most people did not know of this practice. Ben could have taken Dee to the county seat, thus to the hospital in his Cadillac, but because of her pain and the imagined prestige, both he and his wife wanted to use the ambulance. So we called the funeral home. Lewis County did not have a regular ambulance service. The funeral directors were on call with their hearses to pick up emergency cases when they weren't involved with funerals. Apparently funerals and the dead took precedence over the living. Apparently that's where the money was. Mrs. Crow, the undertaker's wife, who answered the phone, told Ben that the ambulance was already on the way to Glenfield to pick up Mrs. Davis, who was having childbirth problems. Ben was incensed. But there was no way to get word to the ambulance. The other undertaker's phone did not answer. As he fumed and fretted, his anger mounted. It seemed to him that it was a conspiracy, a direct affront to the Casey's status and position. It was not long before he was out in the street waiting for the ambulance to come to view. And as it rounded the corner, he waved his arms. The ambulance stopped. Dan directed the men with their stretcher to the upstairs apartment. He was so anxious and insistent that they did not stop to think that it was a Casey and not a Davis that they were picking up. Once Dee was safely in the ambulance, Dan got into his Cadillac to lead the way. "By God, no stoplight or anything's going to stop us," he roared, as he sped off, leaving the ambulance to turn around in his driveway. By the time it got to the corner turn onto the state road, Ben was out of sight. The plight of the Davis family was completely out of his mind. Frank and Fern Davis were a middle-aged couple who had 13 children. The one thing in life that they did well was reproduce. Both had been in high school at the same time, although Frank was a year ahead of Fern. During the Armistice Day parade in Frank's senior year, he bought Fern an ice cream cone at the ice cream park. They dated each